So welcome everybody to Canisius College. My name is Dr. Michael Noonan and I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Human-Animal Relations, a program we have at Canisius College that examines the pressing issues in the ways in which we humans relate to the other species with which we share the planet. And these issues include the ways in which people interact with carnivores. In fact, it's one of the most difficult of all of the topics that we can conceivably address because it brings into focus many of the difficulties we have in our human-animal relations. And our guest speaker today is going to help us think about and address these issues. We're so lucky to have Lisa Upson as our speaker today. Lisa Upson is the Executive Director of People and Carnivores. And she brings a background in law, organizational development, and wildlife conservation. Prior to joining People and Carnivores, Lisa was a wildlife advocate with a national group working on grizzly bear and wolf coexistence and conservation. Lisa is also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Montana's Political Science Department. She has a Juris Doctorate from New England School of Law and a BA from Hardwick College in Oneonta, New York. It is our great pleasure to welcome her as our speaker tonight. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Upson.
Thanks, Mike. I'm greatly pleased to be here this evening with all of you. It's a great honor to be a part of this speaker series. The Institute for the Study of Human-Animal Relations is the institute, and it's had a lot of interesting, even local Buffalo speakers, so check it out on the web sometime. As Mike said, I'm Lisa Upson, and I am the director of a group based in Bozeman, Montana, called People and Carnivores. And so tonight I'm going to be talking about, conveniently, People and Carnivores, is coexistence possible? So my group, People and Carnivores, our mission is to reconnect and restore large carnivore populations by working with people, various stakeholders, to prevent large carnivore human conflicts. And so we work in the Northern Rockies, and we work with hunters, outfitters, agency managers, landowners, other NGOs to prevent carnivore human conflicts. And what that means is encounters between people or property and large carnivores. And I'm going to say a little bit more about who are we talking about here. So tonight, the what, the where, the when of large carnivores. And what about this term coexistence? What do we really mean by that? Challenges and solutions in living with large carnivores. And then what does the future look like? So, okay, so what are we talking about in terms of large carnivores? Who are the large carnivores? What are they? We've got the grizzly bear, the black bear, the mountain lion or the cougar, and the gray wolf. And large carnivores are also predator species because they prey on their food sources. So the funny thing is that bears eat mostly grass and plants. So they're omnivores, but they're located in the scientific order Carnivora, scientifically. So we can call them carnivores, we can call them omnivores, and all of them are predator species. So I'm going to quiz you on that later. No, not. So where are large carnivores today? Where can we find them? Let's start with the grizzly bear. This is the historic range of grizzly bears, about the 1850s, the middle of the 19th century. And this is where grizzly bears are located today. So there's Yellowstone where I live, there's Bozeman where I live, and this is the glacier area, and there are actually 3 disconnected populations of grizzly bears up there. And then obviously up north. But you can see quite a bit of range contraction between the historic range and the current range for grizzly bears. Wolves were found in most of North America, and today they're found in the Northern Rockies. These are the southwest wolves. There's only about 100 of them. And then in South Carolina, the red wolf population is down to probably 30 or 40, and is supported by a breeding program. So that's probably not a viable population. And then we have the upper Midwest as well, and there are probably about 4,000 wolves in the upper Midwest. So that's the largest population in the lower 48 states. Cougars used to be found in most of North America, except for the upper climes, and now are found in the western portion of the continent and mostly the lower 48. Black bears, similar story. They're found in more states, but you can see there's still a significant range contraction. So why did all this range contraction occur? So wildlife in general and large carnivores in particular were highly persecuted in the 19th century. And as people settled the West, the bison, the elk, a lot of wildlife species were killed in huge numbers of the millions. And large carnivores presented a risk to agricultural operations and settlement. And so the populations of especially grizzly bears and wolves went way down, and through like the 1920s. And later on in the 20th century, there was a new conservation ethic. And so here we see President Nixon signing the Endangered Species Act in 1973. And it was in 1973 that the wolf was listed as an endangered species. And in 1974, the grizzly bear was listed by Gerald Ford, although it was probably Nixon's administration that did most of the work. So later in the 20th century, we protected these animals because they were going away too rapidly, and we wanted to build the populations back up. So that did occur. The programs to actually increase their numbers were very successful, starting in the 80s and 90s, in particular for wolves and grizzly bears. And I want to show you just the Yellowstone grizzly bear population growth for a minute. I'm going to animate this map. But here we are in the northern Rockies, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And Yellowstone is right there. And here's Yellowstone National Park right here. And this green blob is the grizzly bear population. So we're going to start in the year 2000. 1, 2, 3. And we're going to go to 2016. And so you can see with protections, the grizzly bear population went from 200 to 6, 7, some claim 800 bears. So a lot of what coexistence is about is helping these people learn how to live with animals that they have not lived with before. So even though Yellowstone is a protected park, and bears were always coming out of the park to some extent, when you see this kind of population growth, we're having to help all these people learn how to live with grizzly bears nearby. And the same thing happened with wolves, because when wolves were protected, they were introduced in Yellowstone in 95, 96, and in central Idaho. And the wolf population within about 8 years expanded throughout the northern Rockies and into eastern parts of Oregon and Washington. And so people had not lived with these animals for about 60 years. Across this landscape outside of the, wolves were out here, and people, had never lived with wolves before. So at the same time, large carnivore populations were increasing towards the end of the 20th century, so was the human development. And this is an interesting factoid. Every 3 minutes, a football field worth of natural area is developed in the West. So it's a really desirable place to live. There's lots of recreation. There's national parks out there, and people have been just coming out and developing the West, businesses, urban areas, lots of hobby farms and ranches intensely for the last 20 years. So a bear roaming around in the West at any one point is going to be 3 or 4 miles from a significant human development. This is a bear trail. a grizzly bear trail. And the bears are coming off these mountainous areas and into cornfields. And that's why that trail exists. Case in point. One of our field guys took this video near one of our project sites. So you can see the ranches and farms in the background. And this is not unusual for a bear to be this close to houses and farms. Where are those cubs? You can see how powerful the grizzly bear is. She's just jogging and going pretty fast. Come on, guys. So you can see what we're setting up here is a clash, and that's what we call the conflicts. We've got wolves and grizzly bears and black bears and cougars close to people. And they naturally want to travel. They're seeking mates, they're seeking food, they're seeking security, and they're trying to reach other populations, and so they naturally want to disperse. And so that's going to take them into areas where there are people. So let's look at this word coexistence. It's a noun, and it's pronounced like that. Can anyone even say that? No. Here's how I pronounce it, coexistence. And it means living peacefully with other. So in this case, it's other large carnivores or omnivores, helping the carnivore wildlife species, the wild carnivores, live with us peacefully and us living with them peacefully as well. So that means removing the conflict from the situation. So this is really about risk management. And so that's sort of the negative way to frame it, and coexistence is sort of the positive way to frame it, but they're the same thing. If we can prevent conflicts from happening, we are coexisting. Love is ideal, but it's not required. So we're not asking people to want to go out and hug a grizzly bear or to love grizzly bears, even though I would like to do both of those things, or wolves. We're just asking for participation in proactive problem solving. You can get up to 45 points in words with friends with this word. And I know that there are some people I know who care about that, so pay attention. So this is not a good example of coexistence. This is, wolves preying on a sheep. So that's property, and that's worth money to people. That's part of their livelihoods, people who are raising livestock. This is also not a good example of coexistence. A little bit too much coexistence. And this was in Yellowstone when bears were feeding from the garbage dumps, and then they could eat right out of the hands of people. And when they closed the dumps, it killed many, many grizzly bears, which is part of why they were listed as an endangered species. So my group, People and Carnivores, we're after connectivity. And here we are in the Northern Rockies. This map right here is that. And we've got a really good habitat location right here in the glacier area, also the Yellowstone area, and also central Idaho. And what we're after is allowing large carnivores to move between those three populations. And there aren't even grizzly bears confirmed in central Idaho, but it's one of the biggest wilderness complexes in the West. So there should be grizzly bears there, theoretically. We want them to get there naturally. And we want wolves to be able to move about those core habitat areas for long-term genetic health, and to make them one population as they used to be. So we work with these valley communities to prevent conflicts so that wolves, bears, and cougars can travel where they need to go without getting into trouble. And you might think, well, why can't they just live in the green areas, right? Like the wilderness areas. A lot of these mountain ranges don't have food sources for large carnivores through most of the year. And some of them they can't even get over. So really, they're seeking the valley bottoms, just like people are, for most of the year. So a little recap on the situation. This is all pretty new. We had extermination in the 19th century, early parts of the 20th century, and then we had a period of time where people were not living with wolves and grizzly bears. And then we had recovery of carnivores, and we had a lot more people move to the west. And so we've got potential conflicts, and a lot of people are not happy about this. And this has really happened in just the last 20, 25 years, because wolves were reintroduced in the mid-90s, and the grizzly bear population grew really at the end of the 80s and 90s as well. So coexistence is something that we're still figuring out. We're still learning a lot about what works and what doesn't work. So how do conflicts happen? Let's dig a little deeper. It's really about attractants on the landscape. So the animals are moving about, and they are sort of taken off their natural course by attractants. So mountain lion attractants include people, unfortunately little kids. If there's a cougar in the area that's actively hunting, people should be careful. It's extremely rare, but they will go after, pets and kids, especially if there's a lot of their natural prey in the area. They will also attack livestock if they're actively hunting and maybe a little bit desperate, because normally they wouldn't do that. Their natural food source is deer. So wolves are, they go after livestock, and it doesn't need to be livestock. It could be dead stock. It could be a carcass. Their natural food source is mostly elk and deer. But if they really need to eat and livestock is the easiest prey, they will attack livestock. And that's one of the biggest problems we have in the Northern Rockies. Bears are more complex because they're omnivores. They eat a lot more things. So they like chicken, they like birdseed, they like human garbage, they like corn, as we saw. And that's actually all grizzly bear damage of a corn crop. So bears were in there just camping out for a few months, eating all the corn. Well, probably about a month. Fruit orchards, beehives, bears will eat a lot of different things. Livestock, this is one of our field guys took this photo after he looked inside and saw a bear. And so he knew that was an occupied grizzly bear den, and of course there are livestock right there. So sometimes we don't even know how this situation comes together. Seems really dire, doesn't it? People are not attractants of large carnivores. Yes, this guy got mauled by a grizzly bear defending her cubs. And bears will attack humans in three basic situations: in defense of cubs, in defense of themselves. We had a mountain biker really quickly going down a trail 2 years ago that hit a large male grizzly bear and was mauled to death by that bear. And then if they're habituated by human foods, garbage, they're going to come back and they're going to try to find more. And that usually makes them sick, injured, desperate in some way. And then they might prey on humans. Again, it's very rare. So you can see in the last 50 years in the lower 48 states, there really haven't been very many human fatalities from large carnivores. I'll note that there were 2 people that have been killed by wolves in Alaska, just because it might look, it's like wolves can kill humans, but it's so extremely rare. It's only happened twice. And grizzlies, that's mostly Glacier and Yellowstone, and so you can see these numbers are really low. You have more of a chance of dying by car accident, lightning strike, bee sting. You know how that whole thing goes, right? And in Yellowstone, people die more from avalanche and falling into hot springs. So we have these attractants on the landscape. We've got large carnivores who are seeking to move about, and we need to try to prevent conflicts, to keep people safe and to keep carnivores wild. So with wolves, again, we want to protect domestic animals, mostly livestock. Bears, pretty much everything. And domestic animals and people from cougars. I'm lumping bears together, black bears and grizzlies, because it's mostly the same from here on out. So one of our most versatile tools is electrified fencing. And fencing we can put around beehives, fruit orchard, corn crops, garbage canisters or garbage dumps, lots of different things. We innovated, we designed and electrified this mobile chicken coop. And we prototyped it last year and we tested it here. We put some roadkill and some fruit in there. And we have a video of a grizzly bear testing it and getting shocked and running away. And so now we've got 4 of these on the landscape, which is really neat. And for all you free-range chicken eaters, the chicken free range means they're under there and this thing moves. So that's what free range means. We shouldn't talk about that because dinner is coming afterwards. So this is an unwelcome mat. And this is an electrified mat that we use in vulnerable areas of fencing. And it's electrified, so a person or a grizzly bear cannot step on that without getting shocked. So that was another thing that we built. We've got a couple field guys who like to tinker quite a bit and build things, which is really helpful. So electrified fencing is really useful to either deter large carnivores, to give them sort of a negative experience so that they won't come back, or just so that they can't get into whatever it is that we're trying to protect. So fladry fencing, you can see is a fence with red flags hanging off of it. Looks really funny. And that's an electrified line. And so actually what we call this is turbo fladry because it's electrified. And to share more about fladry, I'm going to play a short film. It's almost 5 minutes long, which will give you a sense of the kind of people we work with, and also this tool, and also a little bit about the landscape. Fladry fencing.
I was a total skeptic. When Ted called and talked to me the first time, he said, we want to put up turbo fladry. And I said, what in the world is that? And he said, well, it's this hot wire with flags on it. And I was like, there's one thing that'll stop a wolf, and that's a bullet. And he said, well, no, this works.
In 2016, People and Carnivores worked with John and Kate Hansen and the local government trapper through Wildlife Services, Ted North, to put up fladry around their calving pasture on their ranch outside of Marion. We enclosed about a 40-acre pasture in fladry, and it was a pasture where they had historically had a number of issues with wolf depredations on calves.
We're running about 60 head of cows. We calve right out the window here in the spring, and then they're out on range from June through September. I think our biggest loss was about 7 or 8 calves in a year, which is 10% of our herd, so that hurts. The wolves are here. We've shot at them. We've done everything else trying to keep them out of here, but it's hard to shoot at something if you can't see it.
In 2016, we had fladry up, and we thought it worked pretty well because we didn't have any losses in a field where the Hansens had historically lost calves to wolves. But the issue was we couldn't be sure because we never knew whether we had been successful because there weren't any wolves around or because the fladry was working. So in 2017, we returned and we put up the fladry in exactly the same place, but we added trail cameras around the fladry. And what we found was that wolves were actually visiting that pasture almost weekly.
It was a real eye-opener to see that much activity on the outside of that fence. They're smart. They're not scared of us. They know when we sleep. I think the biggest mistake that anybody makes is underestimating the intelligence of these things. If you leave a spot or an opening, they're going to use it. We had them all the way around this perimeter. It wasn't just in one spot. We'd get them all the way around it.
During that time, we never documented a single wolf inside the pasture, and we never lost any calves. So to me, that's a pretty profound argument that this tool works well in this particular situation.
Our cows are so much nicer to work. We can bring our cow-calf pairs in and my wife and I can sort them off in 20 minutes. Whereas 5 years ago, they were on the fight and they'd see a dog, they were ready to eat it. It was a whole different mindset on the animals that we have. It's helped us in more than just dead calves. It's helped us in the way the whole herd behaves.
Fladry, the tool that people and carnivores used out at the Hansen Ranch, is a pretty simple thing. It's something that's been used in parts of Europe for a very long time. It's a string with red plastic flags hanging from it. One of the improvements that's been made on Fladry recently is that the line that the flags hang from has been electrified. And that's a huge thing because historically, wolves would look at it. It was a very strange thing with all these red flags flapping in the breeze, and they wouldn't know what to make of it, didn't like to go around it. But they would eventually test it. And when they tested it, there was no negative effect. So what we did by adding electrical current to the line, that novel visual thing is actually backed up by a pretty hefty electric shock. It's a non-injurious shock, so it does no lasting harm, but it is very painful. I mean, I can speak from personal experience. It's a powerful incentive to get away from the fence as quick as you can. It makes a big difference when a landowner goes from suspecting that something might be helping to knowing that it is helping. And that's a huge change, and it really helps people get behind tools like this that do take diligence and work on the part of a landowner.
Looking for a solution that works for everyone. That's huge, instead of just trying to stay with the old tried and true methods that, sometimes work and sometimes aren't the greatest idea.
We want to be in that role of being able to help people become more empowered on their own land, to go from being in a situation where they're essentially waiting to be victimized by a wolf depredation to a situation where they're empowered and can actually do something proactive. They can put up a barrier around their pasture, and though no tool is going to be 100% effective, this one works very well, and particularly when it's used in situations like the one on the Hansen place.
The wolves are here, and there's no denying it. There's no use in sitting crying and whining about it. They're here, let's deal with it. This, so far, has been the easiest way to do that for us. And as far as I'm concerned, this is pretty foolproof. It's a real positive thing, and I don't want to be without it now. That's for sure.
For more information, please visit peopleandcarnivores.org.
So that's been a great project for the Hansen Ranch and for People and Carnivores, as well as the government agency partner that we work with on that. We've done it for 3 years in a row and we haven't had any losses, and there were losses every single year prior to that time. So even though we can't measure non-events by preventing things from happening, we know after some time, that obviously these things are working. So who knew that electrified fence with some flags hanging off it would be so helpful? We don't think it works very well, Fladry, with bears and probably not big cats, but we're in the process of testing that. Here's one test recently we did last year. So the cubs are just like, yeah, whatever, I'm walking right in there. And the mom is still trying to make sense of it. So she gets shocked and they very cutely run away. Later on in this series, the mother bear did get inside the Fladry line. So, and it doesn't seem like bears would really be intimidated by some flags waving a little bit, whereas wolves are, which is interesting. For all you cat lovers, like myself, this is a hefty bobcat. Yeah. So there's roadkill in there under that snow. And look at that creature. Mountain lions are amazing. And interestingly, they ended up in there together. And the bobcat wanted to play, and the cougar's like, this is a freak show, right? I'm out of here. So those were not great tests because it snowed and the flags are like held down by the snow, and so there's no movement there. But we don't necessarily need movement a lot with these flags. For some reason, they just look too odd to some critters that they will deter them. So Electric fencing, fladry fencing. We also use carcass removal and composting. So when a sheep or a cow dies on the range or in a pasture, like was the case here, and there's a bear on that carcass, we want to take that carcass off the ranch because that carcass is going to bring in other large carnivores. And so we developed some programs with some of those watershed communities to have a driver, a truck, and the driver goes around to ranches and picks up carcasses and takes them to these composting sites. You can see there's a little calf carcass right there. And so the livestock carcass, the dead stock, will compost really well in these compost sites. And in fact, we've been able to, working with the Department of Transportation, also take roadkill to these sites because we want the roadkill to not be right on the side of the roads. Guard animals are really cool and popular because they look so cool and everyone loves dogs. So we cost share and we help people learn how to work with guard dogs to protect livestock. Llamas can protect sheep, and using different kinds of breeds or steers in livestock herds can deter large carnivores. So anything that presents a risk to a wild carnivore or looks really intimidating or just unusual will get them to be very cautious. We also use scare devices, and that can be either noise or lights. And we've had a lot of success, especially with bears and cougar deterrence, with these fox lights. And it's just a randomized lighting going off. So we can put those around livestock or nearby. Range riders, you might have heard of range riders. It's another tool, more expensive because it involves a human. To be on horseback, to provide a human presence with livestock, or to actively herd the livestock so they stay in bunches. And so if you think about wild ungulates like bison or elk, they stay in herds because that's a natural defense mechanism. But we've basically bred that out of cattle. And so ranchers will take cattle up onto the range and they just scatter. And so we like to hire range riders, and oftentimes this needs a coalition of people to be with the cattle out on the range and actively herd them. Garbage security, residential, is really important. Grizzly bears did this with these garbage canisters. And so we've purchased 30 bear-proof garbage canisters for this community. This is a Kodiak canister being tested by a grizzly bear. So there are certain tools or equipment that have to be certified by the federal government in order to be bear-proof. And so this is bear-proof and can be picked up by an automated truck. And this is one that we use for people who don't have truck service. So people in the West, in rural communities, they keep their garbage outside, but if it can be secured, that's really helpful. There's not a lot of garbage pickup unless you're in a city. So we have a lot of dump issues as well because of that. And local officials, they don't like to keep these lids closed because it's inconvenient for people. There are bear tracks up that ladder. Can't see them. So bears get into these dumps, and these are everywhere. These transfer stations and these dumps are everywhere out in the rural West. So this is a bear guard, and this is Banff National Park in Alberta. And this is electrified, so a bear can't walk across that. And this is a big campground, and they have an electric fence around the campground, and then this bear guard. So you can drive across it, but you can't walk across it. So we've actually built one of these this year, and we're prototyping it right now. We hope to be able to deploy this at that garbage site, which would be really neat. We don't know of any others in the United States. Bear spray is really effective. In fact, it's more effective than firearms with a charging bear. So we do a lot of bear safety education and bear training bear spray training classes using inert canisters so that people can get used to how it feels to spray bear spray. And it works on humans. That's probably the most important reason you need to carry bear spray. Backcountry food storage. Again, we don't want bears to get unnatural foods, because if they get it once, they're probably going to seek it out again, and that's going to put them in contact with humans. So we have a variety of things that we use, and we work with the government agencies to put in the national forests and the wilderness areas. So that's a lot of information in a short amount of time. These 4 tools, range riders, carcass removal, guardian dogs, and scare devices, can work with any of the large carnivores to some extent. Fencing, mostly with wolves and bears. Bear spray, mostly with grizzly bears and cougars. Fladry, just wolves mostly that we know of right now. And then, of course, food and garbage security is important to prevent conflicts with bears. So we also use trail cameras to monitor wildlife presence and also how large carnivores are interacting with our tools. So I'm going to show you a few of my favorite trail camera photos. This is my favorite because I love grizzlies. And you know you're looking at a grizzly bear when you see that shoulder muscle right there. That's a beautiful shot. A black bear trying to get under some barbed wire fence, not electrified. A cougar who needs a meal. And an awesome wolf shot. What about this one? This is in Orchard Park. This is at my parents' house, and we're trying to figure out who keeps knocking over the bird bath. And so if anyone thinks they know what this animal is, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. So trophy cams, they can be good fun too. So why do we bother with this? This is really hard. It takes a lot of human resource. It takes a lot of money. But we're trying to get out of the binary thinking of we have to have one or the other. We can't have both. You know, we can't have people living in thriving rural communities who are safe and their property is safe, and large carnivores. So we can reduce losses for people on the human side and property, and we can keep carnivores wild. And maybe even more than that, we can reduce so much human conflict by collaborating with partners on these issues. So every time we have a project, you know, we're working with the landowners and the government agencies, and people like to solve problems. It feels better than just waiting for something bad to happen. So we've seen a fair amount of human conflict about large carnivores. It's very controversial, be reduced or eliminated because we're solving problems with them. Large carnivores are native wildlife in the West. They have a lot of ecological benefits. We've seen in Yellowstone that the return of wolves is moving elk around. So the plants and the young trees are growing. That's restoring beavers and ponds and bird species that haven't been there, that weren't there for 60 years. And there are places outside of the park where these localized effects of these like ecosystem restoration, basically, because we put the top predator back in the food chain. Preserving wildness and mystery, that's special for me. I'm a big backpacker, and I like to go out and backpack and hike in an area where I know there are big things with big teeth that can hurt me. So that's the mystery and the wildness of nature. We can do this. Is coexistence possible? It is. We can do it. So I'm going to end with another short film, and then after that, I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Wherever people and grizzlies share wild country, it's important to make sure we keep bears from getting unnatural foods. If bears start coming around camps, campgrounds, and figuring out that's a place to get an easy meal, they're going to keep coming back. They're not going to act like wild bears anymore. They're going to be really bold. So we want to prevent those bears from having to be removed or from destroying property or harming people. So when people go out into the woods, into backcountry settings, we're modern human beings. We like to take a lot of stuff with us. A lot of food to eat, and if it's during hunting season and you're successful, you're going to have a lot of fresh meat that you need to store someplace as well. One of the best things to do with that game meat is to get it high off the ground where a bear can't get to it. And what we found is that carcass poles are about the best way to do that. Scott and I built over 200 of these structures now over the last 14 years in places where grizzlies were starting to move back into after being absent for many, many decades. We identify areas that get a lot of use, that people repeatedly come back to camp in, and they're close to places where they're going to be able to hunt elk or other big game animals. We like to have a couple of good live trees as the uprights, somewhere 15 to 20 odd feet apart from each other. That gives us a good wide span for hanging stuff. And then we cut down a tree to use as the pole. It's going to be the horizontal piece of the structure that you throw the rope over and hoist loads up on.
Steve usually does most of the chainsaw work and peels the log. While he's doing that, I work my way up the tree to limit as I go. We use climbing gear in order to be able to attach ourselves to the tree. That allows us to move around up there and to be able to use both hands freely. So we get the log peeled, moved into place, and have attached our 4-to-1 pulling system. The pole is then lifted to our marks that we shot with the laser level. These logs can weigh 350. I would guess that this one has got to weigh well over 400 pounds. This particular pole has an 18-foot span. Your food or carcass has to be hung 4 feet from any vertical structure so that a bear cannot climb the tree and reach out and grab it. That's mitigated more problems than anything. Save more bears and more people.
We take 15 feet of grade 70 chain up the tree with us. That's got way more strength than what we actually need for the structure, and attach the horizontal piece to the uprights with that chain.
Strength of the chain is 3,200 pounds. And then it's wrapped at least twice completely around. This is built to be able to hang a lot of weight on.
It's a pretty exciting time to be working in grizzly bear conservation. You look around the world and large mammals are really in decline. Yet here in a very populated, industrialized nation like the United States, we've actually got this Pleistocene carnivore, the grizzly bear, that is growing in population. If we can do our part to put the tools on the landscape here so that folks can make the right choices and not create conflicts with bears, they can live in a lot more places and thrive and be truly wild animals.
That's it. Thank you everyone for your attention.
That was wonderful. We do have time for questions. Do we have any? I do. I have at least a first question. Do you have a sense of optimism or neutral or pessimism about the future?
Optimism. Yep, for sure. I have a sense of optimism because it's helpful, ironically, that large carnivores are being delisted because more and more resources are being put to coexistence work rather than, keeping the critters on the list and other advocacy, efforts. So right now, coexistence work, because large carnivores are so charismatic and a lot of people love them and want to work on them and help them persist. And so there are a lot of resources now coming to coexistence work. And my group is in the process of creating a vision, a concept paper right now, to develop a program with many other partners for long-term sustainable coexistence, which would require a national funding mechanism. Because this, you can see, this is not cheap, this stuff, and takes a lot of human resources. And so national, federal taxpayers are paying for restoration and recovery. And so we feel that everyone should also contribute to coexistence. So there's a lot of energy around this right now in the West, and so I feel really optimistic. Hi, Sally.
Sally.
Hi.
I want to know how you count how many bears there are.
How you count? Yep, yeah. They do these interesting like DNA studies with hair snags. And so and so it's imperfect, it's not exact or precise. But like they did like a 4-year program to count the NCDE, the glacier area bears, with this really complex DNA hair sample study. And so they would set up these traps where there'd be like ways to get bears to like scratch against trees or like have to go under a fence, and there'd be little catches that would get the hairs, and then they would test the DNA, and they then know how many individuals are in that ecosystem.
So going off of your example of the ranch that used the flaggery tactics against wolves, we know that ranching communities often stay in close contact with each other. So do you find that if you use these flaggery tactics on one ranch, a chain reaction could occur on other ranches?
You nailed it. Yeah, the ranching community and rural communities oftentimes are peer-to-peer, and it's funny because we will talk with partners, ranchers, and they're like, wolves are so cool. Their family systems, or like grizzly bears, I love seeing grizzly bears, but they won't admit it to their peers. And so there's a lot of independence and a lot of pride in these Western communities. And so, yeah, when something works, it just, and we do these films and we have dialogue forums in communities, and so we try to leverage the success stories. It works pretty well.
Just with the different carnivores in the area, are you finding that there is a slight concern for the safety of the animals rather than it only specifically being the effectiveness of preventing conflict?
Yes, quite a bit. And that's a large part of our motivation. So we know that, we want carnivores to stay wild. We want people and their property to stay safe. If there are conflicts, oftentimes the wild carnivores are killed. And so there is a concern there.
Given your discussion of the historical range of mountain lions, do you think that there is a possibility of them expanding eastward, and what do you think would be the implications and the response of communities?
Every now and then one tries to get out here. In fact, I think there was one hit by a car a few years ago in Connecticut. It was this rogue cougar. They aren't in this area that we know of. So, they naturally try to travel, but I don't know that enough of them can come out and not get killed to sort of say something like we're recolonizing mountain lions in the east. I doubt it.
There is talk of a continuous stretch of land that is available to wolves to inhabit from the northern Rockies to Mexico. Do you think this is possible for wolves to do?
I think it's going to happen. And I think it will take 10 or 20 years. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, that wolves will recolonize Colorado, whether that's by reintroduction or naturally, eventually. And we had a wolf from the northern Rockies get to the Grand Canyon a couple years ago, and then she was killed. But they are good travelers, and so if we could connect the northern Rockies with the southwest wolves, that would be incredible, and it would help that struggling population down there. There's only about 100 in the southwest. So I think it's going to happen. It's just going to take some time and a lot of groundwork, a lot of coexistence work.
I have a few more. Do you have a sense of whether this movement that you're part of towards coexistence with carnivores is a North American phenomenon? Do you have a sense if there's similar movements in other continents? Are people in India beginning to tolerate tigers? Are people in Africa beginning to adjust to wild dogs?
There are a lot of efforts in other countries. Europe, Africa has had to, you know, and you going over it, you probably have heard of some of those. Mongolia, and yes, India, Nepal with tigers. So there are other, the landscape is different. The tools are a little bit different. There are guard dogs used differently. The farming and the ranching is different. And so it's all contextually based. But yes, there's a lot of coexistence work around the world. So we can draw some lessons, although the context really matters a lot.
And in our urban communities, we think about with wildlife issues as distant ones, you know, that exist either in India or maybe in American Rockies, but not in Orchard Park, not in Buffalo. Are there smaller carnivore populations, smaller carnivore issues that can be informed by this large carnivore focus?
Coyote issues are big in Orchard Park right now, according to a listserv. And
are they a problem in Western New York?
People are starting to think they are a problem, and it's upsetting or unsettling to some people to just hear them, if they're hearing them howl, if that's really true, or seeing, you know, den sites or seeing a few of them. You know, people get concerned because it's new and it's a threat to their pets.
Are they well informed, or is it mythical like with wolves? Are coyotes indeed a threat, or do you think not?
Well, I think, you know, they're a threat in the sense of, yeah, they could take ground animals. You know, they would kill a cat. And so to the extent that people are worrying about their pets outside, I think, you know, it's so unlikely that something would happen, but I think there's a small threat there. And people certainly feel it, which is really the most important thing. So we have to deal with what people are feeling, like even if it's not, you know, even if it's somewhat, you know, made up or whatever.
I know that there's a big movement and a desire in the ecological community to have otters come back, but otters are in fact, like what I had in mind when I mentioned the small carnivore issue, is coexistence with otters, coexistence with coyotes. Do you have optimism about that, or no?
What was the second one? Otters?
Otters and coyotes, or raccoons.
Yeah, I do, because I think that overall we have a conservation ethic that will continue on and even grow into the future. But what's going to happen is they will be able to exist in fewer places. And so I think there will be strong efforts of preservation, conservation, but obviously the world is continuing to get developed. And so I think there will be fewer places for them, but people will care about keeping them around.